If you're going to be writing Python code that uses functions, it is extremely important to understand the difference between mutable and immutable data types. Otherwise, you'll eventually be really surprised by some sneaky logic errors in your code that can be very difficult to debug. The most important thing to understand is the behavior of your code when a variable is passed into a function. When you pass in a variable with a mutable data type, such as a list or a dictionary or a set, think more complex data structures. You can modify that variable inside of your function, and those changes will persist outside of the context of that function, even if you don't return the updated variable from your function. On the other hand, when you pass immutable types, integers, floats, booleans, strings, tuples, think simpler data types, into a function, any changes that you make to those variables will be lost as soon as that function goes out of scope, unless you use the return keyword to pass the updated value back to your main method, or whatever other scope was in context when you first called that method. Consider these two very similar functions. One of them is modifying an integer and the other is modifying a list. They're both structured almost identical, except one of them is adding 25 to a number and the other is adding a new element of new thing to the list that gets passed in. Let's start with our modify int function. Since integer is an immutable type, when we call that function, we'll see that if we don't return the value or do anything else to pass that value back to the calling context, we're going to lose the changes that we made. We started out with the value of 10, we display that, we see that it's 10, and then we call the modify int function, and after that function runs, if back in our original calling context we display it, we can see that we don't have that updated value of 35. Instead, we have that original value of 10 still. On the other hand, with our modify list function, we can see that if we create a list, pass that list into our modify list function, and make a change to it in that function, even though we don't return it or do anything else to it, when we come back into our calling context, we'll see that since list is a mutable type, those changes that we've made have still persisted. We've managed to modify that list in the function and have those values, those modifications that we made to the list still exist back in the calling context, even though we didn't return any values, and this is because list is a mutable type, unlike our integer, which is an immutable type.